Hey, so before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that I recently released this poster of extinct butterflies as my first piece of Atlas Pro merch. If you'd like to help support this channel or are just an appreciator of fine art, check out the link on screen or in the description. Thanks. Alright, one second. Time to start the video. So guess what? I found another atlas. And before you ask, no, this did not come from a yard sale. I actually found this while helping my mom move out of my childhood home. A closer look will probably confuse you all at first, as this isn't actually an atlas but the Random House Dictionary. However, if we open this up all the way to the back, we'll find Random House managed to squeeze a whole atlas of the world into this as well. Though the more time I spent exploring this atlas, the more I started getting a weird feeling, as if I recognized this from somewhere. That's when I realized the graphic design here is very similar to the last atlas we looked at. Everything from the line work to the flags, right down to the color choices for countries, they all perfectly match, telling me this can't be a coincidence. So I flipped all the way back to the front, and sure enough, right here we can read how the entire contents of the atlas and the index to the maps comes from C.S. Hammond and Company, which, if you'll remember, is the same group who put this atlas together. So despite what it looks like, what we have here are two virtually identical atlases, with the only real difference between them being what year they were printed. And considering how much fun we all had when I made you guess the age of this thing last time, I thought let's dive in once more and try to figure out how old is this atlas. Alright, let's get into it, shall we? The very first page of this atlas starts with a diagram of the solar system. While this isn't much to go on, it is a good hint as to what was on people's minds when this was being printed. Though once we flip this open, we'll finally see our first map, a rather plain Mercator projection of the world. Now this is a pretty standard map to see, especially for older atlases like this. But if you'll remember, this first Hammond atlas we looked at started with a different kind of world map, one that used a polar projection, the explanation behind which was to better fit the air-minded age it was printed in. So the fact that this map doesn't do that tells us it wasn't printed with commercial aviation in mind. What's perhaps even more revealing is actually the page right before this, where we'll see the very first map in this atlas is actually of the surface of the moon. And this may already be the most telling page in this entire book, as notably only one side of the moon is shown, the one that we can see and study from here on Earth. This is a good reminder that what lay on the far side of the moon remained completely unknown to mankind until the Apollo 8 mission, when we passed behind the moon for the first time, though this wouldn't happen for another 2 years after this was printed, resulting in what you see here, a map featuring just one side of the moon. Then below that, instead of a map, we'll find 3 blurry images of what appears to be Mars. While these might be low resolution by today's standards, at the time they were taken, they were some of the clearest pictures ever snapped of the red planet, and I can only imagine how exciting it must have been to start seeing images like this appearing in atlases. Overall, this glimpse into the most advanced space imagery of the age is a real good clue as to when this was printed, as this was clearly made during a time when space exploration was both very new and very popular enough to occupy the first pages of this atlas. On the next page, we'll find another world map, only this one focuses on the geography of the ocean floor, which is pretty cool, not gonna lie, as this atlas didn't have anything like that. Though initially I didn't expect there to be very many actual clues here, as this map is sparse on text, but then I happened to notice down here along the Marianas Trench we'll find its deepest point labeled the Trieste depth. This struck me as odd because today we know this point as Challenger Deep, but I guess before this name was settled on, Trieste was used. This name refers to the first submersible to ever explore these depths, which was another significant moment in human history, making the Trieste briefly a household name.
Slowly, the intruders leave the sun behind and gradually sink into an uncharted land of perpetual night.
And I think this serves as a good reminder that before interest in space exploration really took off, exploring the extreme depths of our oceans occupied much the same place in the public imagination, with names of submersibles like the Trieste earning their place in publications for the depths they first explored. While this might not be the best clue, if we look over here in the Atlantic, the only other name we'll find is the Archimedes depth, again referring to the submersible that first explored the bottom of the Puerto Rican Trench, the deepest point in the Atlantic. And this is notable because this voyage only took place just 2 years before this book was printed, making its presence here another telling clue if you know your oceanographic history. But alright, what's next? North America? Nice. To be honest, there's not much really going on here in terms of clues, as the names and borders of this continent have remained relatively unchanged since they were first laid out, but there are a few small hints, so let's take a quick look. The most obvious one, but the one that also gives us the least information, is the Northwest Territories, part of which have since been renamed Nunavut. If you guys know of even one more thing I could have mentioned about Canada, please let me know in the comments. Though things do get more interesting moving on to Central America, where we'll find the US remains in control of the Canal Zone, though this detail was a lot more useful in the last video. The only truly telling piece of information from this page comes from looking down here at what was once known as British Honduras. This was honestly a little surprising to read, as I did not expect parts of North America to still be under colonial rule by this time, let alone British colonial rule. Though perhaps what's even more surprising is that it wouldn't be for another 7 years after the printing of this before this territory would be renamed Belize, and 8 years after that before Belize would achieve true independence, making this the final British colony in North America. Though we'll find a similar case on the page for the West Indies, where we can see many of the islands that are now independent countries, such as St. Kitts, British Antigua, British Dominica, British St. Lucia, British, and Grenada, British. However, if you really pay attention, you might notice how one of these islands, Barbados, does not have this label, and that's because the very same year this was printed, Barbados became the first Caribbean island to achieve their independence from the Brits, making this quite a good clue for my Caribbean historians watching. Moving on to South America, I didn't think it was possible, but perhaps even less has changed here. I mean, Venezuela's flag now has 8 stars rather than 7, Peru's flag no longer has this big icon on it, but only one flag has been fully replaced, that of Suriname. To be honest, I've never seen this flag before, but I kinda like it, as it's definitely unique, and it looks like the flag of like a failing fast food chain or something, though I looked it up and apparently each star was meant to represent a different ethnic group present in the country: white, black, brown, yellow, and red. Listen, don't hate me, those are just the colors of the stars, but if you found that to be a little problematic, well, so did the Surinamese government, as this flag sorta just solidified the racial divisions within the country, rather than helped them all blend together, explaining why they opted for a new flag 9 years after this was printed. So if you're some kind of expert in flag history, this might help point you in the right direction. But alright, the next page is on Western and Central Europe, which I have a feeling is the page you were all waiting for. We have a partitioned Germany, a united Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and of course the big boy, the USSR, though I'm not sure this gives us any specific details that'll help us determine its age. The only flag that's any different is Austria's, which has since also gotten rid of this ugly emblem for a more simple design, but this is what we saw in the previous atlas as well. Something I did find interesting, however, is this small text box up here that tells us how the government of the United States has not recognized the incorporation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union, which is something I just never really knew before, but it's also not that helpful, so let's keep looking. The next page is on the British Isles. Now, just like last time, I can't really pick up on any changes that have taken place here, but everyone in the comments of the previous video yelled at me for missing all the great clues that are apparently here. Specifically, everyone seemed to know what year it was based on the Greater London area alone. How exactly? I'm not sure, but here, have a good look for yourselves and tell me what I missed in the comments again. Next up is France, which also has all sorts of regional borders I bet some of you could spend hours dissecting for more information, but I really just don't know enough about France to even start. After that, we have a partitioned Germany, though I don't know if there's anything to be learned from looking at this either. I mean, sure, the fact that it's partitioned at all tells us something, but I can't find any details that'll help us get more specific than the Cold War era. So we're moving on to Scandinavia and Finland, which, yeah, not much to see here either. But then there's a whole page dedicated solely to the Mediterranean, which I guess is cool, but also kinda just unnecessary, and it sort of feels like they included this just so that they could throw in a map of the Roman Empire as well. Apparently, this has been on our minds for some time now. The next page is for Italy, which, I don't know, not much to see here either. Next is Spain and Portugal, which, sorry, but yeah, nothing here as well. Oh, well, I guess Spain's flag is technically different than it is now. Although it's almost indistinguishable from the modern flag, this centered icon implies a huge difference in the government of Spain, as this is what flew during the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. Though this clue is pretty hard to notice, and I wouldn't blame you for missing it. The next page confused me a little, as this is where we'll find the Balkans. Now, to be fair, almost everything here is the same as it was in this first atlas too. Yugoslavia, Romania, Communist Bulgaria, Communist Albania, but then here's Greece's flag. And yeah, I know this is the same flag they fly today, but it's not the same flag Greece flew when this atlas was made. So I guess they originally had this flag, switched it to this, and then switched it back. After this, we have, yes, who could forget, the good old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, though it too appears unchanged from the last time we saw it. Look, I know I'm blowing through these real fast, but trust me, I'm really just trying to get to the places that actually have really substantial clues. And with that, now we're looking at Asia. The first page is on Southwest Asia, or what we now call the Middle East. At first glance, this also appears very similar to what we saw in this atlas, with Jordan still administering the West Bank, the same neutral zone between Iraq and Saudi Arabia we saw before, and some strange southern borders. But a closer look at these will reveal some subtle differences. For instance, what was simply the United Arab Emirates in this book is under the name Trucial Oman here in this book. This is the name the British gave to this region after striking truces between all the local emirs, implying this was still a British colony, a decent clue considering this would only last another 5 years before becoming independent, though an even better clue can be found directly south. You see, here in this first atlas, this area again is simply known as Oman, but then here in this atlas, we'll find it to be Muscat and Oman. This would only change 4 years after the making of this atlas, when the Sultan of Muscat and Oman was deposed by his own son in another plot supported by the British, and ushered in the Sultanate of Oman, which stands to this day. However, the final clue from this region might be the best one yet, as below this we'll see Yemen is once again split in two, just like it was in here, but their names are different than before, as this time the northern half is simply called Yemen, and then this part is South Arabia. The nondescript name paired with this pink color makes me think this area was also under British colonial administration.
The job goes on. The massive, unending job of protecting the protectorate. It's been a hard day's flight, and tomorrow will be another. But this is why they came here.
Sure enough, after looking it up, I learned the British only relinquished control over this area just 1 year after this was printed, so if you know when this colony came to an end, you should have a good idea of how old this is. Next is the page on Southern Asia, and if we look closely on this side of India, we'll see Pakistan, and then down on this side, 1,000 miles apart, we'll see Pakistan as well. This tells us our atlas was printed after India achieved independence, but before the Bangladesh Liberation War, just 5 years before to be exact. Another good clue if you know your South Asian history. The same goes for the island off the coast of India known as Ceylon, another name left over from British occupation, and would only be changed to Sri Lanka 6 years after this was printed. The only other notable clues lie in the many names of Indian cities like Bombay or Calcutta, though there are too many of those to go through, so let's turn the page over to East Asia now. Again, most of the clues here are in the many names of Chinese cities that have since been changed, like Peking into Beijing or Canton to Guangzhou. However, a funny detail I couldn't help but notice is that North Korea's flag has once again aged poorly, with its red ink having decayed into a brown color. If you'll remember, this happened in the other atlas as well, and for some reason has only affected North Korea, despite all the other flags on this page having red as well. I honestly don't know what to make of this at this point. Like, why is it only happening to North Korea? My guess is that they must have used a different, probably darker shade of red ink to print North Korea's flag with, one that degrades over time. Though who knows, maybe I just missed something in my research and this is actually perfectly accurate. Turning over to the page on Southeast Asia, we actually have a lot to talk about. First, looking at Vietnam, we'll find a North Vietnam whose capital was Hanoi, then there's this really small partition line, and below that is South Vietnam with the capital of Saigon. This division is even reflected in each state having their own separate flags. Despite this, Vietnam remains one solid color, implying it was still considered a single country despite its internal divisions, hinting at the complex political situation currently unfolding here. And it was this unstable arrangement that led to the United States getting directly involved in the region, which started the very same year this atlas was printed. So if you know when American troops first landed on the shores of South Vietnam, you should have this whole thing figured out. The flag of Laos is also different, as this one represents the Kingdom of Laos, though this isn't that great of a clue, as this was only changed a full 10 years after the making of this atlas. But there's one last clue all the way down here, where the island of Timor is split between Indonesia on one side and Portuguese Timor on the other, the last colonial holdout in this region, which also only lasted 10 more years. After this, we have the page on Australia, which I'll admit is probably the least helpful page in this entire book. I couldn't find even one notable difference here, though I mean, please feel free to prove me wrong and tell me exactly what year this was printed using this page alone, but I'm going to carry on. Well, actually, next is New Zealand, which is pretty much unchanged as well, so let's just turn this once more, and now we're on the page dedicated to the Pacific Ocean. And what I find interesting about this page is that there are no flags associated with any of these territories, and that's because none of them were actually independent nations by this time. Here we'll see the territory of the Pacific Islands, which was a US Trust territory. Below that, the territory of New Guinea was an Australia Trust territory. The Solomon Islands were a British protectorate, and so on. So if you know around what time these states started receiving recognition as independent, you may be able to figure this out. Finally, that brings us to the final portion of this atlas, Africa. Just like last time, I can't help but feel like this continent was sidelined, as it again only received a single page in this atlas, despite the fact that it was one of the most politically active parts of the world during this time. But even still, there are loads of small clues to pick up on. First, below Morocco, we'll see Spanish Sahara, as well as the small territory of Ifni, telling us Spain was still in possession of their African colonies, which is actually a pretty helpful detail, as it was just 3 years after the printing of this that Spain ceded Ifni back to Morocco. Another good clue can be found by looking over here, where we'll find not the country of Egypt, but rather the United Arab Republic. This was another short-lived union between Egypt and Syria, though by this point Syria had already bailed, leaving just the Egyptian half, and it wouldn't be for another 5 years before the country officially renamed itself simply as Egypt. Then there are some less than helpful details that I still think are interesting enough to point out, such as Burkina Faso still being Upper Volta, or Ethiopia still being in control of Eritrea, or Madagascar still being referred to as the Malagasy Republic. But to be honest, most of these will only get you within 5 to 10 years of when this was printed at best, though there are 2 clues that will help you get even closer. To start, we can check out this inset map for the islands of Réunion and Mauritius. Although Réunion remains French territory to this day, Mauritius achieved its independence from the British just 2 years after this print. And then second, here in the middle of South Africa is the state of Rhodesia. This had once been the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, but the yellow color it's illustrated in implies it was no longer a colonial possession, but rather the independent state of Rhodesia at this time, which is another really good clue, as Rhodesia only declared its independence the year this was printed. That brings us to the very last page in this atlas, where every African flag is listed, and we can find a few more clues. The first one I noticed was Burundi's, which admittedly does look like its current form, except for the icon at its center, which used to be a drum with a flower in front of it. This is helpful as it's what flew during the reign of King Mwambutsa, who ruled Burundi up until the very year this was printed, when he was deposed also by his son. But then there's also the flag of Lesotho. While not completely dissimilar, this earlier version was the design adopted the same year Lesotho first achieved independence, which also just so happens to be the year this was printed, making this one of the earliest official depictions of this nation and its flag, and another perfect clue for any of you Lesothoan historians out there. Beside this wall of flags is the map of Antarctica, though I can't say there's any useful information here, which means we've now seen every page of this atlas. Overall, I'd say there were fewer clues in this atlas compared to this one, or in other words, if this one was an easy difficulty, then this one is maybe a medium difficulty. That being said, there is more than enough information in here for you to be able to figure out how old this is. So before I give the answer away, just like last time, you all owe me a comment. What's your prediction for what year this was printed? There's no way you watched through this whole video without having an idea or two, so come on, don't be shy, let me know your thoughts down below. I'm serious, I'm not going to share when this was made until every last one of you have left your guesses. And while I wait for you all to write your comments, I'm going to use this time to plug my poster one last time. Featured here is every butterfly known to have gone extinct from around the world, each one meticulously hand-drawn for maximum detail, the result being a beautiful poster with a sad story, or really 23 sad stories behind it. As each of these makes their way towards obscurity, this poster is my way of keeping the memory of these lost species alive for just a little longer. Not only am I so proud of what I've made, but these posters are also my only ticket out of doing sponsorships, and I think we can all agree this is better than me talking about VPNs or whatever else YouTubers are pushing nowadays. So please, if I've piqued your interest, feel free to head over to my store using the link on screen or in the description and pick up a poster for yourself. Thanks. But alright, I think that was the last of you leaving your comments, so without further ado, it's time to reveal that this book was printed for 1966, meaning all the information in it likely reflects the state of the world in 1965. That makes this roughly 14 years older than this, which is pretty crazy considering how many differences there are between them. If nothing else, I hope this has demonstrated just how dynamic the world was during this period. This coming from the 60s also explains why outer space was featured so prominently, as this was the same time the Apollo missions were taking place, so it's easy to understand why space was on the forefront of everyone's mind. 1965 is also the year the US got directly involved in the Vietnam War, a fact I'm sure was a dead giveaway for some of my older audience.
The time
0630, September the 7th, 1965. Mission, Operation Piranha.
Though now I'm curious, what clues were most obvious for people from other countries? What details did I miss that people from your home would recognize immediately? And most importantly, what can we learn from all of this? I don't know about you guys, but every time I open a new, old atlas, I realize there's a whole chapter in history that I know next to nothing about, and the only way to fix that is by diving into historical artifacts like this and seeing firsthand what the world was like not so long ago.
(1966), a year that will be remembered for a multitude of events, all of which helped to shape our life and times. 1966, a tapestry of people, places, and things. 1966, documenting a kaleidoscope of cause and effect, progress and stalemate, joy and grief, triumph and tragedy.